just show up at the door tomorrow night. But before we get started, I wanted to introduce, or the talk today is going to be New York City of Kings, the history of New York graffiti. I actually asked for this one because I love New York and I love graffiti, so this would be really great to see. If we could all make sure that our cell phones are on vibrate or mute. And let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Mariah Hausman. Thank you so much.
Thank you to Highlands for hosting these great talks. Thank you everyone for being here. I'm excited to be here and to talk a little bit about my research with you and some really cool information that I learned through a very intense crash course in graffiti this last year. I have always researched and studied outsider artists. If you don't know what that refers to, those are artists that have come into their practice through alternative or unconventional means. So that's been one of my primary research subjects. And so sometimes outsider artists refer to artists who have been untrained in the formal sense. So what you're looking at today is a bunch of tags, what we call tags in the graffiti vernacular. And these are identity marks created by many graffiti artists. And I would not be here today if it were not for my partner Al Diaz and Eric Fellisbrett, who invited me into the world of graffiti when they were tasked with the concept of creating an informational, educational timeline exhibit, which discusses graffiti as it pertains to the New York City specifically. So these are all New York City artists that you're seeing here. So I would want to start initially and ask or pose the question, what is graffiti? We've all seen graffiti since you were a child in the school bathroom. You probably saw words marked in the bathroom stalls and on walls in cities and urban landscapes. So when I first start to try to study things, I look at the origin or what the meaning of that word is. And so if you look up what graffiti means in the Webster Dictionary, it's going to say that it's drawings or writing scribbled, scratched, or sprayed illicitly on a wall or other surface in a public place. So regardless of what our current understanding or experiences are with graffiti, that is the formal definition of it. And such graffiti has been displayed globally in different places. Sorry, I'm trying to move my screen a little bit and got stuck. But going back as far as Pompeii in 79 AD, where we have history of graffiti mark making, and that was political. And as you can see, it was rather decorative, and it was preserved by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. So we have this proof, and the Romans were definitely graffiti centric. And another question I bring up is this art or is it illegal? And I would like to pose the possibility that it is both. Certainly it's considered art in some cases, but another big question is, how did graffiti go from being an illicit, illegal, destructive act of defacement, which is commonly understood, to something that it is a solicited art form with cash value? So basically, how did we go from illegal mark making, which it is illegal, it's not okay to write on public spaces. However, what's happened in today's world is that people are being commissioned and given permission, formally given permission to create art on walls. But I want to go back to the origins of this and go a little further back, not as far back as Rome and Pompeii, but back to the 1960s. The project that I did with Al Diaz and Eric Fellisbrett focused on New York City and the concept of telling the story of graffiti from the view and the eyes of the artists who formed this movement themselves. And this is intended to help us understand how something could have actually started in one particular place in the United States and spread internationally. You can go anywhere in the world and you're going to see street art and murals and graffiti on walls. So this has become part of our current and present popular culture. And so I'm here to try to kind of backtrack and figure out how that happened. And that's a map of from the 80s, early 80s of the New York subway system. And so that's going to take a big role in this talk today. So the first phase, the way we decided to present this as a timeline, which was a massive timeline that became an installation as well as an educational book. The idea was to inform people and to explain and clarify. And we not only did we create a massive sort of, to overuse the word immersive timeline, which you would physically walk through and experience the step-by-step evolution of graffiti, but we took all that information and we packaged it in a book, which is intended to be an educational book that teachers can use to teach the class as it's presented here, the history of New York graffiti, or a history. Because everyone's opinion about the history may have different, slightly different perspectives. But this perspective here is going to start in the late 1960s with what we call the wall era. And we decided to call this section of the timeline Genesis. It's going to go through chapters. We have 7 chapters. And during Genesis, there was a lot of social and socioeconomic challenges that people in New York City were dealing with, which heavily influenced graffiti. And so I'll be talking about that. And also we'll take a little look at what graffiti tags looked like at the very beginning. They were very crude. This one here is Taki 183s. But each of these sections is going to include some current events. Some things will be familiar to people. So we wanted to make an association with what's common knowledge, as well as specific New York lore and history. And so I'm going to just sort of skim past some like major current events that were happening when this was going on. Richard Nixon was elected. We were in the, dealing with the civil rights movement, and Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. There was a lot of urban decay in New York City because it was experiencing bankruptcy or imminent bankruptcy, and so there was not enough money to maintain the city in the way that it deserves to be maintained. There was a massive influx of immigrants there, who many of whom were in poverty, so that affected the climate. This also affected heightened crime. The police force was underpowered and unable to take enough action to make change. Architectural decay, drug use. What the result of a lot of this was that a lot of kids were unsupervised. They had nothing to do or not enough to do. They were running around loose, wild in the streets after school, or probably even during school. Also, other interesting things, we were about to land on the moon, or we were imminently landing on the moon. The Woodstock concert occurred, the Vietnam War was going on, and pop art was trending. So during that time, these kids were out on the street, and they didn't have enough to do, and they were socially, like all kids at about age 12. And this was the average of the kids that started experimenting with graffiti and writing on public spaces. They were kids, they were 12 to 16 years old approximately. And they started noticing this tag that said Julio 204 around the neighborhood. And this was in a certain particular neighborhood in New York City called Washington Heights. And the kids started seeing this little Julio 204. And pretty soon they all started trying their hand at this, and they were using markers and spray paint. And here you see some of them and what their tags looked like. And so it became like a social pastime. It was a search for identity. It was a way to be someone amongst a place that was, you know, literally decaying around them. They needed an identity, something to do, some way of making themselves be important. And so part of this had to do with marking your turf and seeing how many times and how many places you could get your name up on the wall. And so the more you would see, the more you would recognize that person and the more famous that person might become within that community. And the most famous person around that time was Taki 183. These kids were primarily, a lot of them were Greek, Dominican, Puerto Rican, African-American. There were some Anglo-Irish kids mixed in there, but it was a very diverse, multicultural group of kids. And Taki was part of the Greek collective, and he had a summer job as a messenger. And so he went out into the city, and everywhere he dropped off something for his messenger job, he would write his name. And he ended up catching some attention through the New York Times, and an article was put out about Taki and saying, how could this be happening in our city where everything is getting marked everywhere? And part of the reason why this was spreading and hitting everywhere was this had to do with another one of the words that are coins that the graffiti artists use, which is called motion tagging. And what they did was they were smart. They figured out that if they tagged buses, trains, and anything that was mobile, they were going to get more people to see their names. And they all wanted to be like Taki. They wanted to be famous and come out in the New York Times. And so they were spreading their tags all over New York City. And the kids in Brooklyn, say, were seeing the Washington Heights kids tags and vice versa. And so that the subways were carrying these tags everywhere. And so it really exploded. And a lot of kids were doing it. We're talking like eventually probably thousands of kids were doing this. And so, and I'm really massively abbreviating what's in my book. Like I'm breaking down things that are much more complex to very simple, trying to fit it, confine it to this presentation. But the birth of graffiti had to do with these crude, fast-made tags that were like slapped up all over the place. And they also formed sort of like a society, like a secret culture that only they shared. And remember, these are kids. They're not even late teens. They're middle schoolers, basically, essentially. And so what happened soon, very quickly after motion tagging and the genesis, was what we're calling foundation and the code. And the code is the secret society's ethics, their language, their way of living, their way of dressing. And during this foundation, we discussed the fact that during this time, again, there's political and social issues going on. Where the kids are seeing on TV, the space shuttle program being talked about on the news. Terrorism was starting to become something that was broadcast. The Munich Olympics suffered a terrorist attack that was actually broadcast globally. We were starting to pull troops out of Vietnam. The Watergate arrests occurred, which is a huge political drama and debacle. The World Trade Centers were built. Pablo Picasso died. New York changed a lot by changing the mandatory sentence for drug crimes, and this really increased the number of people in prison, which was a huge social change. Also, gang violence was a thing. It was not just local, it was national, but some graffiti has to do with gangs. Sometimes there's a negative association with graffiti because a lot of gangs have used it to mark their territory as well. And that was all a result of urban development, gentrification, and the resulting poverty and the lack of resources. So while that was going on, the kids were still able to get busy with their secret society. They had a certain way of dressing. They have a certain way of talking. They had places they hung out. They formed what are sometimes called writers' benches or crews, meaning like teams, like groups, like kind of like clubs of guys who would hang out and share their graffiti tags with each other. And at this point, they started evolving their hand styles. They started adding to what they were tagging. So it was no longer looking so crude because they wanted to stand out. They started making their tags larger. They started making them more colorful. They were still needing to do them fast. Like graffiti has to usually happen really fast because it's not legal. So you have to do it before someone catches you a lot of times. This example here that you're seeing is a really famous example by one of the primary cornerstones of New York City graffiti. And this is by phase 2. And it's interesting because it shows his evolution. He's sometimes been given credit to inventing bubble letters, which we've all seen, those puffy letters that regardless of whether he invented them or not, he did them very well and he made them very recognized, and he's known for what are called softy letters, or softies. So these guys were writing these things in their black books, hanging out after school or, wherever they ended up converging, in the park, on the corner, in the subway. And they also had a certain code that they had to abide by in order to be cool and to fit in. And that had to do with certain things, a lot of things. But one of those was that you had to steal all your paint. You could not buy your paint, you had to steal it. And so sometimes these more colorful and larger pieces would be referred to as masterpieces. And here you see an authentic photo of someone in a train yard quickly spraying something. So while this sort of advancement in style was occurring, we also were starting to face some recognition by the establishment that this was not okay and it was making a mess, and citizens were getting upset because some things were messy and not everybody thought graffiti was beautiful. Here you're seeing one of the more larger elaborate tags that has evolved from the cruder ones that I mentioned earlier. But there was also, meanwhile, there's some criticism, there's also some acceptance. Like this is a film or a still from a film at Lincoln Center, which captures a bunch of graffiti. One of those crews, one of those clubs, which was the UGA club, which was a very important early crew, they were hired to do graffiti while Twyla Clark had a performance going on at the Lincoln Center, which was called Deuce Coupe. And she was, her creative approach to this was to show a more contemporary version of ballet. And so there are really cool films of these guys like behind the dancers, like spraying this piece, which was on this rotating canvas that was in motion. And so it was very exciting. They, the funny end to the story is that they got fired. The dancers didn't like smelling the spray. They were probably smoking joints in backstage, and they ended up not finishing that whole route. But it's a very famous pivotal moment when audiences started to accept this. And meanwhile, galleries and others were also taking a look at this as being like some kind of phenomenal art form that is just like sprouting out of nowhere. So during the peak chapter, they refined their approaches, and there was an extremely massive number of people doing this and covering walls with this. And it was a very robust period of time in graffiti, possibly the most robust in New York City graffiti. Other things that were happening, we got our first Jewish mayor in New York City. Muhammad Ali was knocked out George Foreman in Zaire, Africa at Rumble in the Jungle. Nixon was pulled out of, or forced to resign out of the presidency after Watergate. We were in a recession, a national recession. The Supreme Court decided that death penalty wasn't such a bad thing and it would be okay to instigate. And we had our 200th bicentennial. Alex Haley put out Roots, which was a huge cultural phenomenon. We had finally a Democrat in office. The Enterprise was completed, NASA's space shuttle. And in New York, the Son of Sam serial killer got started and was really creating a lot of fear in the environment. There you're seeing a picture of, I believe, the politicians looking at, this is a typical landscape of New York at that time. Like, this is not like a war zone. This is actually what parts of New York looks like then. And there you're seeing the response to Henry Ford's response to New York's bankruptcy problem. This famous newspaper heading was just saying, like, you guys are gonna have to figure this out. Federal money is not gonna help you out of this problem. So meanwhile, the graffiti artists are getting a little older, they're getting wiser, they're dealing with, this continuous financial collapse around them in the city. But meanwhile, they are escaping into their art. They are creating more colorful, larger pieces. They are being referred to as style masters. They're competing with each other. Who's better? Who's doing it that better than who else? So things are really exploding as far as like the evolution of what's happening. You're going to start seeing different kinds of graffiti applications. They're still doing it on trains. They're still doing it on walls and in black books. But they're really pushing to improve their style and their innovation. And they started doing bigger things. So they went from, these little small crude things to something more, and now they're doing whole entire train cars and even whole entire trains. So that would include like up to 10 cars, I think. So they would require a team of themselves to get together and to actually fill up that whole train, because they were usually doing it in the nighttime, in the dark, with flashlights and like working as fast as they could to get it done. So that when the train rolled out in the morning, people would be like, what happened? And a lot of people really liked it, and a lot of people thought it was kind of cool, and a lot of people were really horrified by it. So it created some sort of conflict. But you're also seeing concepts begin to arise in the work. Here you're seeing a cartoon character, and some of them started to tell stories. They celebrated holidays. There was a bicentennial train. So a lot more development was happening. Also, Norman Mailer and John Nahr wrote an incredible document, which is photographic and an essay, and it really gave insight into this youth culture, and it's an incredible piece. You can find it online, and it's a book, and it was also published in Vanity Fair, and it was a really big turning of the tides, because it really was like, hey, these kids are not trying to vandalize everything. They're just trying to find something to do and to be better at what they do and to have a place in society. So these are other examples of peak train concepts, the holiday one and one above. And you'll see that it's much more elaborate. It's starting to get more complex. So that really explosive period of time, which when we did the timeline, we had to cut out so much, we couldn't fit it on the wall, and it was still extremely dense. So much happened then. So like I said, I've skipped many things. Like some kids sadly were hurt or died doing this. It's a real serious game, and it requires risk taking and a lot of gut to do this work. So at this point, we're talking about a revival, because the city really was like struggling with trying to figure out what to do about this. And there had been like a previous sort of like renaissance and explosion, and then it was like, okay, what do we do now? So other things that were happening, we had a lot of nuclear discussions about issues going on with nuclear threats. The New York City blackout occurred. Apartheid was hot and heavy, and like there was a lot of stuff happening with that. the blaxploitation film genre exploded. Milton Glaser put out the I Love New York campaign, which was in fact that campaign was designed to try to uplift New York and try to help correct some of the problems that had been happening. Also, MTV came out. There were a lot of PC and tech advances. The first portable Walkman was designed and put out. CNN, the first all news network came out. We had our first in vitro test tube baby. The Bronx was burning during the Yankees World Series event when they won. We sadly lost John Lennon, and the census showed that Hispanics were nearly half of the total population of New York City. So those things say a lot. The last thing that's really important here is that Ed Koch was elected New York City mayor, and he's the one who made it his personal mission to eliminate graffiti from the city. I chose to use this. I tried not to highlight any particular artist, but this one is really important in my mind because it's a turning point. This is when you start seeing graffiti becoming muralistic and less train focused and more about public enjoyment for art's sake. And this is done by Lee Quinones, who's an active artist now, who's done a lot of important work, but I'm bringing him up here because he is the one who said, I'm going to take this out of the subways and put it where people can go to it. So instead of the art going to people on the trains and on the buses, etc., now it's being placed somewhere for people to come and they're drawn and invited to see it. So this piece is really important. And he actually wrote on it, graffiti is art, and if art is a crime, let God forgive us all. And so he's very much a driven artist to create art for art's sake. Meanwhile, Ed Koch is getting pretty busy. He's figuring out ways that he can try to put a stop to this, even though it's gone very much out of control. And at the same time, galleries and collectors, there's an art boom happening in New York City. That it became a thing that you could trade in your Picasso and get like a big load of money to put a down payment on a house for. So art became so valuable that it became like a commodity that could be shared. And so this was really a different kind of thing that started to happen at that point. And so they were looking for new artists and new genres and new things. And they looked at graffiti, galleries, collectors, news media, as I mentioned, books, films began to be made about graffiti and graffiti artists. People were embracing graffiti. And so some of these photos were taken by people who began to document these things formally fairly early on, in like around 1980 approximately. You're starting to have professional photographers and filmmakers document this work. And so here's a Village Voice article that's like celebrating the artists. By the way, a lot of them have nicknames. So these aren't their real names. These are their graffiti names, their tag names. This piece at the bottom is a really famous piece photographed by Henry Chalfant, who is an important graffiti documentarian, but he also is the co-director of Style Wars, which is one of the first, if not the first, film that focuses on graffiti from the eyes of the graffiti artists. The Fabulous Five were a crew that were invited to Europe, and this is when graffiti left the soil of the New York City graffiti left our soil and moved on to international places. And so some of these guys started making money doing graffiti. So it was no longer like this illicit act anymore for some of them, a few of them, a select few. They were able to sell paintings and have gallery shows and maybe sell works to collectors. Here you're seeing also Keith Haring, who's also an important figure in sort of like helping to create a bridge for the public's embrace of graffiti. He was not an outsider artist, he was a trained artist, but he loved graffiti and he practiced real graffiti illicitly in the subway. But he also started doing murals using his hallmark style, and his work, as you'll see in a little bit, starts to also bridge acceptance for street art, and kind of starts to create this blur between what the differences between graffiti and street art. Another really important thing that happened then was the SAMO conceptual graffiti, and I'm not going to talk a lot about SAMO because that's a whole other talk, but SAMO was a really important graffiti campaign that was done in the late 70s that started dealing with concept rather than decor or decoration. So it was message making. It was saying something important, trying to speak. And that was done by L. Diaz and Jean-Michel Basquiat. So at this point, things had gotten pretty tough with the government. The government was getting pretty frustrated and they were desperate to figure out how to solve it. And buffed is the word that graffiti artists use for getting wiped out, getting cleaned. So if you put your graffiti up and someone cleans it off, that's called buffed. So we're in the early 80s now, and AIDS is becoming, uh-oh. I think my Zoom crashed. So if you're out there in the Zoom world and you don't see anything,
If you want to stop your share and then start it again, maybe that'll.
sorry, I was trying to hurry up and finish to really badly crashed. It's frozen. Hang on there, I'm coming. Oh, I noticed that some people did more than 30 minutes. Am I overtime? Am I okay? Sorry, guys, just take a quick minute break out there. Aha.
That help.
Oh, yeah, that was great.
Thank you. I'm sorry. Sorry for that technical problem. I hope out there on Zoom you guys can
Are you sharing?
no,
We're not seeing
I
it
need
yet.
to share. Are we good?
Yes. No, we see.
Cool, okay, so anyway, thank you out there. Where I was that I was talking about AIDS. AIDS was a mystery. Nobody knew why people started to die, and that was very scary socially for a lot of the people that were in New York City in the 80s. Another interesting thing that was happening in the early 80s was that artists from all over the United States were starting to flock to New York because it was really cheap to live because of this urban decay. You could live for very cheap. And you could do more art and work less and still afford to live. So a lot of these artists were some of them were getting sick, and it was creating a sense of fear for younger people, or at least younger artists. We were still in a national recession. There were terrorism and assassination attempts were happening globally. Ed Koch was elected second and third time. So he stayed in office the entire span of graffiti, almost the entire time. The nuclear arms rallies and talks were still going on. There was still continuous racial tension and violence. We were still doing innovative things like sending the first woman to space, designing the Macintosh. Reagan was reelected, so we had Republicans in office. And then again, referencing to the art, the Guerrilla Girls were starting to do public activism art in the city. And also the environment was starting to show signs of problems. The ozone layer had a hole in it that the scientists discovered. So that was the beginning of some things that we're very familiar with today. So let's find out how Koch upped the ante in his war on graffiti, and he actually called it the war on graffiti. There were ad campaigns, there were lots of things that he did. He had celebrities talking on TV about how that graffiti should not be happening. And that was the wrong way for kids to spend their time. He continued to do things. One of them was that he and the MTA is the Metro Transit Authority that is in control of the public transportation in New York. They decided that if they started realizing that if they cleaned off the trains, because of the competition, if it was clean, there would be less of like people joining in on it. And so if you didn't have a chance to have your identity driving around town for very long, it was less of a motivation to do it. So this was another reason why graffiti started moving to other places, is because it would be more permanent and you could get your presence known in a more permanent way. So this is a picture by Martha Cooper, who's another famous documentarian of graffiti, who photographed a white train, and these white trains were supposed to be like this flagship plan, but they really were kind of like perfect white canvases for graffiti. So they would have to take these trains out of service, and it affected public transportation because the trains would have to go get cleaned. So they're buffing trains. Meanwhile, amongst graffiti artists, there was some tension that they started competing amongst themselves more. There was less of a camaraderie in some ways, and I think there was more negative stuff going on. There was fear and this this feeling that you might last even for a shorter time out there. I think that affected them. But at this time also, some early pioneers started doing highway bombing, which is a quick tag in a dangerous place. Bombing doesn't mean it's in a dangerous place, but highway bombing is kind of like indicative of like you're taking a higher risk by doing that. So at this point, it was survival of the fittest. They were fighting amongst each other. The government's cleaning things up. They called this policy the run clean policy. And so there's a lot of animosity against the local government between the graffiti artists, obviously, and the cleanup crew. But at the same time, there was even more international and widespread popular culture acceptance. Wild Style premiered. This is a movie about graffiti and about graffiti artists, which featured real art by graffiti artists. It's a very famous, important movie from this topic. Cooper and Chalfant published their landmark subway art book. So a book was published about art, calling graffiti art. The first graffiti magazine launched, which was called the IGT or IG Times. And you can see that over there, and it's making fun of Ed Koch. And also some laws were passed that were more stringent on minors who were doing bad acts. So this all contributed to this sort of survival of the fittest mode. The reset chapter, we're starting to get closer to the current day now. These are diehards. You have to be really tough and really resilient, and you've got to really be driven to keep doing this after you're suffering legal consequences. Your work doesn't get to be posted up for very long anymore, and maybe there's even infighting amongst the group. So this period of time is sort of like a more dwindled version of graffiti. Ed Koch was finishing out his last term. We had a lot of disasters and more major public issues that were concern, nuclear accidents, abortion rights, which have been always in the news, were really increased at that time. Pop artist Andy Warhol died, and he's important because he brought a lot of this interest. His interest in commercial products and colorful artwork helped also contribute to the acceptance of what is sometimes called low art. It's not high art, it's not blue chip art, it's considered on a lower level by some. they were figuring out some drugs for AIDS. There was also rioting that had, occasional rioting in New York, but there was still rioting going on in the 80s. The Central Park jogging incident, this woman was attacked, and the people who supposedly allegedly attacked her, it was kind of like a racial profiling situation. Seinfeld began with some cheerful news. The Exxon Valdez tanker spilled 11 million gallons of oil, and the Berlin Wall opened. So meanwhile, the Clean Car program claims victory. They said all train cars are clean. So as soon as they got dirty, they would take them out of service, and that was one of their modes to stopping the graffiti. And they increased police. They had a lot more. They had these ad campaigns. There was a lot more going on that put pressure on graffiti artists and made it harder for them to do their work. Also, Keith Haring, I mentioned him before. He did the Crack is Whack mural, and this is one of the first times when the street art is being used as like political activism, like sharing of concern, issues that are important to the community. That thing is still there, and they are preserving it. It's a very important public art piece, and he did sadly die of AIDS, but he used the remaining years of his life in the late 80s and early 90s to put things like this all over the world. So he did contribute to some degree, and kind of like making the change from graffiti as an illicit thing to it being accepted and sort of a beautiful public installation. So, and the renowned photographers continue to document the graffiti, and this is a famous photo that Martha Cooper took. And over there on the right, you see the clean train. At the beginning of my proposal or presentation, I showed a really dirty train. Here's a clean, shiny train. These guys found it more exciting and more challenging to put their graffiti in very dangerous places. I included the Stan Smith piece, not because it's beautiful, because it was very hard for them to put that there. They had to climb on the Brooklyn Bridge above, like, I don't know how many hundreds of feet above, but very high up above water. I mean, they could have easily died. And so graffiti artists are starting to do things that are even more risky in some ways. Another important thing that happened was that the Museum of American Graffiti opened. Martin Wong was a collector and a big advocate for graffiti, and he made a big difference in also contributing to the acceptance of graffiti in the gallery format. Also, the other thing that was happening was, like, we had desktop publishing and hand video cameras now available. So things, documentation could be different, and people could do it yourself, So there was the first documentary series by Videograph Productions, which was focused on graffiti topics. And we were, there we were in the late 80s. Now into the 90s, we start looking at how graffiti has become part of a way of life. And we called it the fields blur eternal, because now it's harder to define in our popular culture vernacular the difference between graffiti and street art. And so there really is a difference. Graffiti is illicit, and street art is an installation that was commissioned and planned usually, but so that there's a separation between the two. However, people talk about them as if they were the same thing. So we all know a lot of this stuff. I think to summarize, we've had more awareness of our different cultural existences and more conflict in getting along about that. We've had terrorism do major damage, and we've really, what I find is interesting when you look at these abbreviated events over the course of 40 years is that you start seeing how our environment is in upheaval. There's more hurricanes, there's the tsunami, there's an earthquake, and then the coronavirus also affecting us. So all of this stuff is going on around the graffiti. And so I'm almost done here. The advent of desktop publishing facilitated make it yourself magazines. Also, the internet facilitated the sharing of graffiti globally. So these things allowed more and more people, more increased people way outside of New York City to see all of this. 5 Points was a landmark location that was established for graffiti artists to come from all over the world to add, or muralists to add their work. And so it's become like it's no longer there. Long story, but the 5 Points, people came from all over the world to work there and to see the work. Tourists would go there to see the graffiti installed on a huge space. So what you're starting to see is more legal planned mural production and commissions really kicking in. More females involved. I haven't talked about women. There were some women involved, but I think there are a lot more probably today than there ever were in the beginning. This is a picture from Beyond the Streets, which is a huge traveling street art exhibit that has been to LA, New York, I believe Shanghai, and probably will continue to tour. But now you're seeing graffiti in a gallery in a really formal, like high-end gallery format. The first graffiti auctions came out. The Brooklyn Museum formalized graffiti by giving it a show. And another interesting thing that I just threw in there was that you start seeing stickers, like they're called slaps, and you see them everywhere. Slaps are an easy, really fast way to leave your mark. So it's also sort of like a peripheral element that's spurred from graffiti. And during the pandemic, a lot more graffiti appeared because there were a lot less police looking out for that. So that was also a major kind of milestone thing. So how, and I'm about to close out here. Surely this couldn't have just started in New York. I mean, it was everywhere, right? So this is a debate. However, we know that most of the graffiti that we recognize today, a lot of it has provable origins that stemmed from New York City in the late 1960s or in the 70s. So, it's impossible to figure out when this first egocentric name and number, and those, by the way, I didn't talk about the numbers. The numbers have to do with where you lived and your street or your apartment number or the location that you came from. So the numbers are very much originating from New York City graffiti. When we see a number attached to graffiti. So we don't really know, but we do know it's celebrated. I thank you for listening. These are some really great reviews we got from some pretty well-known people that I'm really proud of. And I really encourage you to check out our book. And it's full of sources. The last thing I'll say is that the book was a lot of, the whole project was a lot of work, but the book is special because you can't find any graffiti book with this many references in it, I promise. So this book has sold really well because it's got a lot of good content. So thank you for being here. I appreciate it.
Was there any questions?
Many thank yous.
Many, many thank you.
Oh, nice. I'm trying to look at the chat, but I'm definitely having some freezing.
Mariah, hi, my name is Mistel. I just wanted to know what made you want to study graffiti?
Well, I've always been, I've been researching outsider artists for most of my academic career, and my primary research subject is Jean-Michel Basquiat. He did partake in graffiti, but also my partner is Al Diaz, and he sucked me into it. But it's just such a great challenge, and it's so interesting.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. Thank you so much. Great presentation.
Thank you.
No other questions? Thank you so much. Really appreciate this conversation. I think we could have probably gone on for a couple more. I was ready to go for another hour.
So,
But we thank